6 months ago, my life imploded in ways I never saw coming. One minute, I was going through the motions of a regular workday. The next, I was caught in a storm that would rip everything apart. It started with a phone call. My wife, Linda, her voice sharper than usual, snapped, "We need to talk when you get home," and hung up before I could respond. No context, no explanation. I figured it was the usual money problems, some household frustration. But when I walked through the door that evening, the truth hit me like a wrecking ball. "I've been seeing someone else," she said, eyes darting anywhere but at me. My world tilted, the words sinking in like ice in my veins. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was who she had betrayed me with. Mark, the so-called friend who had laughed at my jokes, clinked glasses at my table, and played the role of trusted confidant. The kind of man you'd never see coming until the knife was already buried in your back. For weeks, I tried to salvage what was left. Counseling, compromises, the humiliating effort to hold on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. But Linda had checked out long before she admitted it. Her words were hollow, her apologies obligatory. It became clear she wasn't just leaving our marriage, she was rewriting the entire story to make herself the victim. The more I fought for us, the more she painted me as the problem. And Mark? He didn't just watch, he inserted himself into the destruction like he was entitled to it. Then came the divorce. Brutal, expensive, and designed to bleed me dry. Linda's demands were relentless, her strategy cutthroat. And Mark, always lurking, made sure I saw just how easily he had stepped into my life. My lawyer warned me to stay composed, to let logic win over emotion, but every encounter tested the limits of my restraint. The final insult came when Mark cornered me at a neighborhood event, his smirk smug, his words laced with taunts. My fists clenched. I wanted to break him, but I walked away. That night, alone in a house that wasn't mine anymore, something in me shifted. I was done being the victim. I wouldn't fight them. I would fight for myself. I poured my anger into rebuilding. The gym became my sanctuary, each weight lifted a step toward regaining the strength I had lost. I revived old passions, woodworking, running, things that reminded me I was more than the broken man they had left behind. Friends I had neglected started coming back. Piece by piece, I rebuilt. But the wounds Linda and Mark left didn't heal overnight. The nights were the hardest, long, suffocating hours where the silence pressed in, forcing me to relive every moment. Through it all, my kids kept me grounded. Their laughter, their innocence, it reminded me of the one thing Linda and Mark couldn't take. I had to be the father they needed, the one person in their world who wouldn't let them down. Months later, as I lay in my prison cell, I understood one thing. I had survived. I would rebuild again, one step at a time. The prison was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy. Dim lights barely cut through the darkness, shadows stretching along the cracked walls. It was close to 2 a.m., and I lay on the stiff cot, staring at the ceiling, hands behind my head. Sleep never came easy here. My mind was too loud, dragging up memories I wished I could erase. The rhythmic click of footsteps echoed down the corridor. 1, 2, 10. The guard passed my cell without a glance, his face blank, his job routine. He wouldn't be back for at least another hour. I stopped tracking time. It didn't matter. In 5 days and a wake-up, I'd be walking out of here for good. 7 months of a 1-year sentence behind me. My job would be waiting, but everything else? That was gone. Mike, my brother, had held my life together while I was locked up, fixing my car, managing what was left of my finances after the divorce and legal fees gutted me, making sure I had something to come back to. Was I angry? That didn't even begin to cover it. But anger wouldn't serve me here. I understood now why long sentences break men. You don't live in prison. You just exist. And I was one of the lucky ones. This place was a joke compared to the real monsters up north. I closed my eyes, trying to force sleep. I missed my old room. The blackout curtains. The bed that didn't feel like a slab of rock. But that life was over. Mike had visited a few days earlier. Sitting across from me, the plexiglass between us, he smirked. "I'll pick you up next Tuesday. What's the first meal you want?" I didn't hesitate. "A big steak. Medium rare." He laughed. "That's easy. Thought you'd ask for something tougher to sneak past my wife." Mike had offered me a place to stay while I got back on my feet. "It's nothing fancy," he admitted, "but it's clean. And it's yours." I thanked him, and he brushed it off. "We're family," he said. "And don't worry about Mom and Dad. They'll come around." We both knew that wasn't guaranteed. Some wounds don't heal, no matter how much time passes. "Seen my kids?" I asked. Mike nodded. "Yeah. Emily's the same. Ethan. Well, he's got one of those awful bowl haircuts all the kids are into now. I let out a dry chuckle. You tell him it looks terrible? Of course. He just rolled his eyes and said I wasn't his dad, so my opinion didn't count. That hit me harder than I let on. I should have been the one telling him. I should have been there. Not much longer now. I was getting out, and I wasn't going to waste my second chance. If Mom hadn't been there, I might have smacked him. Ethan wouldn't have dared talk like that if I had been around. But for now, he and Emily stayed with Linda. The divorce was settled, but she still owed me $65,000 for my share of the house. I wouldn't be surprised if she had already raided our lockbox, but my lawyer had the paperwork in order. When I got out, there'd be no debate. She and Mark had already taken everything else from me. My peace of mind, my home, my dignity. But that was over. Next time, I'd be ready. I just had to get through a few more days in this place before I could start again. Maybe then I could rebuild. I wanted to believe that. Life had been good before all this. Really good. I had never seen the betrayal coming. Later, a few so-called friends admitted they'd known, but none had warned me. Maybe they assumed I already knew. More likely, they just didn't want to get involved. Most people don't. Now, all I could do was wait, plan, and hope the next chapter would be better. I used to think we had a solid marriage, 12 years, 2 kids, a nice house, and jobs we could be proud of. Sure, we fought sometimes, but nothing serious. I loved my wife. I trusted her. I never thought she was capable of something like this. Our social circle was small, mostly other couples in the neighborhood. Most had kids, except for Mark and Melissa, who had struggled to conceive for years. Linda probably knew more about why than I did, but I stayed out of it. Melissa's drinking had become everyone's problem, though. At parties, she would down glass after glass, spiraling from tipsy to mean. Mark, ever the dutiful husband, would stay sober and carry her home. One night, while I got ready for bed, I sighed. Melissa was a mess tonight. She even tried to get Brian to strip down and jump in the pool with her. No wonder he and Sarah left early. Poor Mark, Linda muttered, tossing her clothes onto the chair. I shook my head. She blames their infertility on him. That's just cruel. She refuses to even consider adoption, Linda said. If my husband were more of a man, we wouldn't be in this mess, Melissa had once spat. I didn't know how Mark put up with it. They'll either work it out or implode, I said. I don't think Mark will put up with much more. We're having dinner with them next week, Linda reminded me. I groaned. Let's hope she behaves. She didn't. When dinner night came, Melissa was in rare form. Loud, obnoxious, demanding drinks. Waiter, how's a girl supposed to get a drink around here? She shouted, drawing stares. Then she turned on Mark, berating him in front of everyone. His face burned red with frustration, fists clenched under the table. Trying to defuse the situation, I stood. Melissa, you promised me a dance. She hesitated, then let me lead her to the dance floor. We swayed through a few songs, not really dancing, more like me holding her upright. Then she slurred, I need to pee. I led her to the restroom and waited outside. After 5 minutes, I asked 2 women going in to check on her. One came back shaking her head. She's passed out in a stall. With help, I dragged her to the sink and splashed cold water on her face. She stirred but couldn't stand. So, I half carried her back to the table. Mark's face was tight, unreadable, caught between embarrassment and exhaustion. I'll help you get her to the car, I said. I got it, Jake, he snapped. This isn't the first time, but it'll be the last. Ignoring him, I helped carry Melissa while he grabbed her purse. We loaded her into the back seat, and I patted Mark's shoulder. Sorry, man, I said, though the words felt hollow. Mark exhaled, staring at his wife's unconscious form. Thanks. I don't know what to do anymore. You need help, I told him. Counseling, something. You can't handle this alone. Linda and I are here if you need anything. He nodded, but I doubted he'd do anything about it. Their marriage was already circling the drain. 3 weeks later, sirens cut through the quiet of a Thursday night. Flashing lights lit up the end of the block. I ran outside and saw Mark's car smashed into a parked vehicle. Firefighters were prying open the driver's door. What happened? I asked a neighbor. It's Melissa, they said. They fought. She grabbed the keys, sped off, and crashed. I watched as paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, Mark climbing into the ambulance after her, his face hollow with worry and exhaustion. The next morning, Linda called, her voice sharp with panic. Melissa's on life support. Meet me at the hospital. When I arrived, Mark sat in the waiting room, staring at nothing. The doctors say there's almost no brain activity, he said numbly. We sat in silence until Melissa's parents arrived. Their grief filled the room as they spoke with the doctor. The decision was made. The machines were turned off. 2 days later, surrounded by loved ones, Melissa slipped away. The funeral was packed, sorrow thick in the air. Despite everything, Mark's love for her was undeniable. He took a month off work, retreating to his family. I promised to look after his place while he was gone. That night, getting ready for bed, I turned to Linda. I love you. You know that, right? She smiled, tired but warm. If I ever end up like Melissa, pull the plug. I wouldn't want to live like that. Don't talk like that, I said. It was a tragic mistake, but something like that could never happen to us. Still, the past few weeks stuck with me. I pulled her close, grateful for the life we shared. At least, that's what I told myself. Mark came back a few weeks later, trying to pick up the pieces. He asked Linda to help sort through Melissa's clothes, and I helped him haul out the old bedroom furniture when he bought a new set. By the 3-month mark, he seemed to be finding his footing. But looking back, I should have seen it. The way he and Linda started to linger in conversation just a little too long. The way she softened toward him, giving him the kind of attention she had stopped giving me. I had no idea that the worst betrayal was still ahead. The neighbors tried to help Mark move on, inviting him to gatherings and even setting him up on a few blind dates. Nothing stuck. It was too soon. But as the months passed, he started looking like his old self again, laughing, enjoying himself, even joking around. It was a relief to see, or at least, that's what I thought at the time. Looking back, the signs were there. Subtle at first, but they were there. Linda and I still shared the same bed, the same routine, the same life. But something had shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. One night, I asked, "Is something wrong?" She flashed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Not really. Why do you ask? You just seem different." She laughed, but it felt forced. "Maybe you're just not getting enough Zex." I frowned. Zex? That wasn't a word she'd ever used. It had always been making love. A small thing, but it stuck with me. I ignored the unease. I should have trusted my gut. Then came Friday, August 20th, the day my world imploded. Linda called me at work. "The kids are staying with my parents this weekend," she said. "What time will you be home?" I smiled, thinking she had something special planned. "I'll come home early." Excited for what I thought would be a romantic weekend, I pulled into the driveway and immediately noticed 2 cars parked outside. One of them was Mark's. Confused, I walked inside to find them both standing in the kitchen. "Hey, Mark." I greeted him, my gut already twisting. "What's going on?" Linda took a deep breath. "Jake, we need to talk." I forced a chuckle. "About what?" "Divorce." The word was barely above a whisper. It felt like the air had been sucked from the room. "What?" "I'm in love with Mark." Her hands fidgeted as she avoided my stare. Rage erupted inside me. "Mark, get the hell out of my house. Now." "Jake, this involves him too," Linda protested, moving closer to Mark. I clenched my fists. "You have 3 seconds before I throw him out in a body bag." Mark hesitated, then turned to leave. Linda followed, but I blocked her path. "We're talking. Now." "There's nothing to talk about," she said coldly. "I'm sorry, but it's over." I felt my heart hammering in my chest. "How long?" I demanded. "Since before Melissa died." Mark spun around, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," I shot back. "While I was supporting you through your wife's death, you were screwing mine behind my back." I turned to Linda. "You disgust me." Her jaw tightened. "This is my house too." "Not anymore." I pointed to the door. "Get out." Mark grabbed her arm. "Let's go." As they left, I stood there in the kitchen, my life in pieces. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed. The rage took over. 2 beers in, I started smashing dishes. The microwave. The cabinets. I punched holes in 4 walls. 4 trips later, Linda's entire closet was emptied onto the front lawn. I turned on the sprinklers for good measure. By the time I locked the doors and threw on the chains, Linda was outside screaming at me. I cracked open another beer, then another, ignoring her. By beer 6, I passed out. When I woke up, her stuff was gone. At least I didn't have to drag it to the curb. The anger hadn't faded, though. It burned hotter with every passing thought. I called her parents to check on the kids, but her mom shut me down. "Linda picked them up last night," she said. "Impossible, Diane. She was too busy collecting her clothes off my lawn." The line went dead. Furious, I canceled our joint credit cards, withdrew as much cash as I could, and started planning my day. Change the garage code. Install new locks. Move valuables to Mike's house. As I was about to leave, the doorbell rang. A man stood outside with a thick envelope in hand. I didn't answer. I knew what it was, divorce papers. He'd find me eventually, but not today. I called Mike, filled him in, and told him to keep my valuables safe. She's a piece of work, he muttered. I drove to Home Depot, but on the way back, I saw Mark's car parked in my driveway. Linda was loading boxes into it. Something inside me snapped. Instead of driving past, I floored it. My car slammed into his, shoving it into the garage door. I reversed, hit him again, then pushed his car halfway through the garage before my engine stalled. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed my son's baseball bat and started swinging. Glass shattered. The windshield cracked. Mark cowered in the driver's seat. I was about to rip open his door when I heard shouting. "Drop the bat. Hands on your head." I turned. 2 officers. Guns drawn. I let the bat fall, raised my hands, and dropped to my knees as they cuffed me right there on my own driveway. Mark crawled out of the car, pale and trembling. Linda stood nearby, sobbing and talking to the officers, shooting quick glances in my direction. I grinned at her. At the station, I was booked and given 1 phone call. I called Mike. With it being the weekend, I spent 2 nights in jail. Monday morning, I stood before a judge, pleaded not guilty, and had my bail set. Mike paid it. As we walked out of the courthouse, he shook his head. "They're talking about attempted homicide. Assault with a deadly weapon." "I know," I muttered. First stop, the bank. By the time we got there, Linda had already drained our accounts. The CDs and bonds were still in the lockbox, but a court order blocked me from touching them. Furious, I called her. She answered on the second ring. "You could have left me $5 damn," I said through gritted teeth. "You're cheap," she replied coolly. "I need that money for me and the kids," she continued, as if she were the victim here. "You mean for you and Mark?" I snapped. "Or is he too broke to take care of you?" "I still have a house payment," she said. "Maybe I should light a fire in the living room to keep it warm." "Jake, stop talking like that," she said, her tone shifting. "Why can't you just move on?" "I will," I shot back. "Once you send my kids home." She sighed. "I can't. Not right now. Not with you like this." I clenched my jaw. "I don't think you'd hurt them," she continued, "but I can't take that risk. You'll see them after this settles." Click. The call ended. I stood there, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. She had taken everything. I wasn't going to let her keep my kids, too. "You don't need to worry about them," I snapped. "You and Mark, though? That's another story." "I'm done talking," Linda replied coldly. "From now on, go through my attorney." Then the line went dead. Weeks later, in court, my lawyer argued temporary insanity, claiming Linda's betrayal had made me snap. Linda and Mark painted themselves as terrified victims, using the restraining order as proof. "Mr. Lawson," the judge asked, "did you tell Mr. Davis he'd leave in a body bag?" I kept my expression blank. "I don't recall exactly," I said. "But how would you feel if your wife was screwing your best friend?" The judge didn't appreciate the honesty. My lawyer sighed. "Say nothing more. Forget everything you said or did." Daniel, my boss, took the stand, calling me a model employee. It helped, but the judge still postponed his ruling. The next day, Daniel pulled me aside. "Jake, I know guys who can make them disappear." I almost laughed. "Thanks, but this is my problem." 6 months and $12,000 later, I was divorced. Linda walked away with half of everything. The house went up for sale. She even tried to claim I'd stolen her jewelry, but the lie didn't stick. Still, the system wasn't done with me. The judge sentenced me to a year in jail. "That's insane," I shouted at my lawyer. "It could have been worse," he replied. "With good behavior, you'll be out in 8 months. The charge will clear in 2 years. Do your time and move on." Easier said than done. Appeals went nowhere. My life had crumbled in less than a year. Daniel reassured me before I turned myself in. "Your job's waiting. Stay smart. Watch your back." On Sunday, I saw my kids for the last time before reporting to county jail. Despite all the research I had done, nothing prepared me for what awaited inside. Mike kept my inmate account stocked, but most of the money went toward junk food and basics. No phone, no internet. I started writing just to stay sane. Collect calls every 2 weeks kept me in touch with family. During one visit, Mike said, "I'll have your car fixed before you're out." And I told Linda she needs to give 24 hours notice before stopping by. It helped. but I still had months to endure, thanks to her and Mark. Linda had taken the kids' clothes and hers, but stopped short of touching the furniture. Mike warned her she'd need a court order. She allowed my parents to see the kids every other Sunday, but made it clear it was a courtesy. According to my mom, she called me their jailbird father and promised to set strict visitation terms once I was released. A week before my release, I finalized visitation. Every other weekend, a month in summer, alternating holidays. I let Daniel know I'd need a week to get back on my feet before returning to work. The day I traded my jumpsuit for street clothes felt surreal. Mike was waiting outside. First stop, the nearest bar. To freedom, I said, clinking bottles. Mike grinned. Andy's got a steak dinner waiting for you. You can crash with us a few nights. House is still on the market, no offers yet. Linda wants to drop the price. Dinner was incredible. I ate and drank more than I had in 8 months. By morning, I regretted it. A note from Mike waited in the kitchen. If you're reading this, you survived. Coffee's ready. Keys to your car and house are by the back door. Don't do anything stupid. See you at 5:30. After coffee, a shower, and a shave, I felt human again. Dressed in fresh clothes, I headed to the house. From the outside, it looked the same. Inside? A disaster. Clothes scattered, furniture missing, the fridge full of expired food. The wall where I'd punched during my last fight with Linda and Mark still bore the damage. Upstairs, the kids' closets were empty except for a few forgotten items. My bedroom was stripped bare except for my dresser. The dark spots on the carpet where our bed and Linda's furniture had once stood made the room feel hollow. Downstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and made a list. Repairs. Cleaning. Replacements. I went to the bank, knowing what I'd find. The lockbox was empty. I requested documentation of the withdrawal. The bank had video footage if I needed it. Another hit, but not unexpected. A call to my lawyer confirmed it. Linda had taken everything. The good news, he said, is the court ordered her to return the CDs and bonds. She wants to trade her share of the house for my share of the CDs and bonds, I repeated, anger simmering. Exactly. Tell her to comply with the court order or I'll have her arrested, I said flatly. Back at the house, I assessed the damage. Called Rick, a contractor, for wall repairs. Booked a deep cleaning service for the kitchen and dining room. Ground zero of my last rage-fueled night. At least the utilities were still on. I planned to move back in as soon as I got a bed. Mattress shopping was overwhelming, but I found a basic set for $900. No bad memories attached, at least. When Rick arrived, he inspected the walls, grinning. Must have hurt hitting that stud. Just patch it and paint it. $200 sound fair? That's low. Jake, after what you did to Mark's car, you're a legend in the neighborhood, he chuckled. You're a damn hero. I smirked. If only he knew the whole story. 6 weeks later, the house was repaired, cleaned, and the CDs and bonds were back in the lockbox. Life was stabilizing. The first weekend with the kids felt strange. Hesitant. Like we were all waiting for something to go wrong. Breaking the silence, I looked at my kids and spoke gently. This is still your home. Say whatever's on your mind. You won't hurt my feelings. Ethan hesitated before saying, We love you, Dad. We're sorry about what Mom did. Emily nodded, her face serious. We didn't know about Mark until we had to live with him. We didn't like it then, and we don't like it now. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. None of this was your fault. What your mom and I had is over, but that doesn't change one thing. I'll always be your dad. I love you, and I'm here for you. That night, we ordered pizza, put on a movie, and for the first time in months, it actually felt like a family again. I fought the temptation to badmouth Linda. It wasn't the right moment. Instead, I focused on making up for lost time. I helped Ethan ditch his ridiculous bowl cut, got more involved in their soccer and dance practices, and made them my priority. Friends kept pushing me to move on, date again, start fresh. I wasn't ready. I wasted 14 years on her. I told them bluntly. If I want to stay mad, that's my right. Linda kept pressuring me to drop the house price. I refused. If you want to knock 20 grand off your share, go ahead, I said. Otherwise, it stays. Eventually, we divided the CDs and bonds. She burned through her share in 3 months, new car, fancy vacation with Mark. I banked mine, determined to rebuild the right way. Then, 8.5 months after my release, Mark's house caught fire. The investigation found gasoline poured into the electrical panel and across the backyard before someone lit it up. He and Linda had been out at a soccer game with the kids. By the time firefighters got it under control, The rear half of the house was gone, and the entire place had lost electricity. The next morning, 2 officers knocked on my door. "Jake," one of them said, tone clipped. "You live just a block away. You could have slipped over there and done this easily." I met his stare without blinking. "Then prove it." They threw out more accusations, trying to shake me, but I let them ramble. When I got tired of their little game, I stood up. "I think we're done here." The bigger officer leaned in, trying to loom over me. "Mr. Lawson, we're not finished." "Then charge me," I said, unimpressed. "Or let me go and watch me call my lawyer." I pulled out my phone. They exchanged a glance. The smaller one spoke first. "You're free to go, but don't think for a second we're not watching." I walked out of there with my head held high. One problem down. A few more to go. Since Mark's house was trashed, I offered to take the kids while they figured things out. The repairs were going to take months. I treated it like an extended break, time to make up for everything I'd lost. One evening, when Linda came to pick them up, she got straight to the point. "Jake, I know you set that fire," she said, arms crossed. "The cops might not have anything, but I know." Feigning confusion, I raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was with our friends all day. Or should I say my friends? Funny how you and Mark don't get invited anymore." I smirked. "Want me to put in a good word?" Her eyes narrowed. "Don't bother. We wouldn't show up even if they begged." "Well," I said with mock sympathy, "at least you two have each other. That's what really matters, right?" I let the words hang before adding, "for now, anyway." She caught the implication. "What do you mean by that?" "Nothing." I shrugged. "Just saying, you're lucky to have him." This time, I didn't bother hiding my grin. As the kids spent more time with me, I saw Linda and Mark's frustrations grow. Ethan and Emily confided in me about the fights at home. "Mark needs to stop pretending he's our dad," Ethan said one night, slamming his backpack down. Emily nodded in agreement. Linda, of course, tried to smooth things over, but her efforts backfired. One evening, she called me, her voice sharp with irritation. "Jake, stop stirring things up between Mark and the kids." I kept my tone cool. "I don't know what you mean. I've never spoken badly about you." "Then tell them to respect Mark." I let the silence stretch. "Mark," I repeated, slowly. "Right. Well, he's a backstabbing, spineless idiot who never should have made it past childhood. Aside from that, he's fine." Her sharp intake of breath crackled over the line. "He's good to your kids, Jake. Leave him out of it." "That's not going to happen," I said flatly. "The man means nothing to me. And one day, I'll gladly be the one to spit on his grave." "Jake, I swear." "What's left?" "Linda." I cut her off, my tone turning ice cold. "You already cheated on me. Divorced me. Had me locked up. What else can you possibly do to me?" She went silent for a beat, then hung up in fury. I chuckled to myself. Hard to believe I once loved that woman. Work, on the other hand, was going well. Within a few weeks, I was caught up, and my boss, Daniel, encouraged me to take on more responsibilities. I agreed. More hours meant more money, and with everything I'd been through, I needed the distraction. Most of the new accounts were straightforward, except for one, TBU Incorporated. They were overhauling their manufacturing system, and it required frequent visits to stay updated. The only problem? The engineer assigned to me was a complete disaster. Smart guy, sure, but disorganized as hell. And it was quickly becoming my problem. "Daniel," I told him, "I hate to complain, but if I don't get the right information, this project is going to hit a wall." A few calls later, the company reassigned Natalie Parker, a seasoned process engineer, to work with me. "Jake," she said, shaking my hand firmly. Working with Natalie was a breath of fresh air. She was sharp, efficient, and made sure I had everything I needed. No excuses, no delays. 2 weeks before Phase 1 wrapped up, I decided to thank her with dinner. "Natalie, let me take you and your husband out to dinner. The Hilton where I'm staying has a fantastic restaurant. How about 6 o'clock?" She agreed, and we shook hands before I left the plant at 4:30, looking forward to the evening. Back at my hotel, I knocked out some emails, wondering how people functioned before the internet. At 5:55, I made my way to the restaurant, feeling relaxed for the first time in a while. Right on time at 6 o'clock, Natalie walked in. Alone. I stood to greet her. "Is your husband parking the car?" I asked, pulling out her chair. Her lips curled into a small smile. "Jake, I'm not married." I hesitated, glancing at the rings on her fingers. She held up her hand. "These? They're decoys. It just makes life easier at work. People don't bother a married woman." It spares me the awkwardness of fending off advances and keeps the gossip away. Plus, let's be real, employers think married employees are more stable. That's clever, I admitted, intrigued. But what happens when people ask about your husband? I keep it simple, she shrugged. He's traveling, he's busy, something came up. Eventually, they stop asking. Well, you had me fooled, I said with a grin. Dinner turned out to be better than expected. We talked for hours, and by the end of the night, I caught myself sharing things I usually kept locked away, my past, the betrayals, everything I had fought through the last 2 years. That's awful, Natalie said, shaking her head. You didn't deserve any of that. It's over now, I said, exhaling. I'm just trying to move forward. What choice do I have? She leaned in slightly, her expression soft. You've got a lot going for you, Jake. You're smart, funny, and good-looking. Plenty of women would kill for a guy like you. Her cheeks reddened slightly, as if realizing what she had just said. I chuckled, a little self-conscious. Maybe, but I've been out of the game so long, I wouldn't even know where to start. And honestly, I'm not in a rush. Natalie tilted her head with a teasing smile. Well, you asked me out, didn't you? I laughed. I asked you and your husband out. Would you have asked if you knew I wasn't married? She challenged. I hesitated, then smirked. Probably. She laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. The night ended on a high note, and the next morning, I left town, not expecting to return for weeks. Before I left, I told Natalie to reach out if she needed anything. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could trust someone outside my usual circle. Over the next few months, we stayed in touch. When I was in town, we met up. When I wasn't, we exchanged emails and calls. Slowly, I found myself letting my guard down. Eventually, things turned more serious. And then, just like before, it all fell apart. One Tuesday evening, after spending time together, Natalie kissed me goodnight. Let's plan for a long evening Thursday. Just the two of us. Thursday it is, I said, already making a mental note to grab a bottle of wine and make it a special night. The next evening, with no plans, I decided to try a new restaurant. After some quick searching, I picked a highly rated Indian spot about 25 minutes away. I found a quiet booth, ordered a beer and the sampler platter, and settled in to enjoy the meal. Then I heard it. A laugh, one I knew too well. I glanced around the restaurant, and there she was. Natalie. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man, and judging by the way they leaned in, the way she touched his arm, the way they held hands, this wasn't some casual dinner. Then, they kissed. I sat frozen, my appetite gone. Finishing my beer in silence, I paid my bill and walked out. Whatever internal conflict she had mentioned about not being ready for something serious clearly wasn't troubling her that much. The next day, Natalie was back to her usual self, brushing against me, laughing at my jokes, touching my arm at every opportunity. Everything resolved last night. I asked evenly. She nodded, her eyes bright. Yep, all handled. Tonight, it's just you and me. I smiled. Great. I've got an idea for dinner. Oh yeah, she asked. I found this amazing place last night. Quiet, cozy, great food. The sampler platter is fantastic. Her face went pale. Oh, what kind of place? Indian, I said, locking eyes with her. Her expression faltered. Then she forced a laugh. What a coincidence. I was at an Indian restaurant last night too. Crazy, right? I even ran into someone I knew. I nodded. Crazy. What are the odds? Her smile wavered. Natalie, I said, my voice cold. Jake, I can explain. Don't bother. I interrupted. I've dealt with liars before, and I'm not doing it again. I got rid of one deceitful woman, and I sure as hell don't need another. Without another word, I walked away. I cut my trip short. Ignored every email, every message she sent in the following weeks. Eventually, she got the message. And just like that, she disappeared from my life, just like she was never there to begin with. I cut my trip short and ignored every email Natalie sent over the next few weeks. Eventually, she got the message. Whatever trust one had managed to rebuild was shattered, leaving me more guarded than ever. 3 months later, life threw me an unexpected surprise. Mark's office was near a busy intersection, and his parking lot was across the street. On a chilly Friday evening, eager to get home, he stepped into the crosswalk just as the light turned green. He never saw the black sedan barreling through the red light. The car struck him hard on the right side, launching him over the hood and slamming him onto the pavement with a sickening thud. Witnesses later said it all happened too fast for anyone to react. The two women closest to the accident couldn't recall many details, just that it was a black four-door sedan with tinted windows. Coincidentally, that happened to match my black BMW. The next evening, I was chatting with my neighbor Mike in my driveway when a police cruiser pulled up. Two officers stepped out. "Mr. Lawson, we need to ask you a few questions," the shorter one said, his tone firm. I nodded. "Of course." Turning to Mike, I added, "We'll catch up later." Mike hesitated, throwing a wary glance at the officers before disappearing into his house. The taller officer flipped open a small notebook. "You own a black 2002 BMW 320i, correct?" "That's right," I said, puzzled. "This about parking tickets?" I added with a dry chuckle, but their blank expressions killed the humor. "Is the vehicle here?" "In the garage," I replied, my guard going up. "Mind telling me what's going on?" "We'd like to take a look," the shorter officer said, ignoring my question. I led them through the house, keeping my expression neutral. My BMW was no luxury car, just a well-worn vehicle with a few scratches and dents from years of use. The officers zeroed in on the front right bumper, snapping photos and taking notes. "Can you explain these marks?" one asked. I shrugged. "No idea. It's an old car. I've had it for 8 years. You think it's going to look brand new forever?" Crossing my arms, I added, "Now that I've answered your questions, maybe you can answer mine. What's this about?" "There was a hit-and-run yesterday involving a black sedan with tinted windows," the officer explained. "Your vehicle matches the description. So do hundreds of others in this city," I pointed out. "Got anything more specific? A license plate?" "An eyewitness." "Witnesses only saw the car," he admitted. "Well, as you can see, there's no fresh damage here," I said, gesturing toward my car. "And I can account for my whereabouts all day yesterday. So why am I a suspect?" The taller officer hesitated. "Your history with the sufferer and previous threats put you on our radar." The other officer took a softer approach. "We appreciate your cooperation. We may be in touch again." "Wait," I called out as they turned to leave. "Who's the sufferer?" The taller officer paused but didn't turn around. "A Mr. Robert Davis." I felt something dark and satisfied stir inside me. A slow smile tugged at my lips before I could stop it. "Is he dead?" I asked, unable to hide the curiosity in my voice. "No," the officer replied curtly. "But he's in critical condition." They walked off. I waved at their retreating backs, still smirking. Inside, I opened a bottle of wine, ordered a pizza, and enjoyed a quiet evening. I finished the entire bottle and most of the pizza, feeling content. The neighborhood buzzed with talk of Mark's accident. Some offered sympathy. Others muttered that he had it coming. I didn't lose any sleep over it. 2 days later, Mark's condition deteriorated. He didn't make it. The funeral was set for the weekend. I made sure to show up looking my best, fresh haircut, new suit, polished shoes. Even got my car washed and waxed. As I arrived at the funeral home, conversations outside fell silent. All eyes turned toward me. Inside, I ignored the guest book and walked straight down the aisle. Linda, seated near the casket with my kids, looked like she'd seen a ghost. She scrambled up, trying to intercept me, but I moved faster. Reaching the open casket, I leaned over, staring down at Mark's lifeless face. Then, without hesitation, I spat directly onto him. A thick dribble landed on his pristine shirt, staining the fabric. Linda screamed tore through the room. "You son of a..." She broke into sobs, hurling insults at me. I smiled wider. Leaning in just enough for her to hear, I muttered, "2 down, 1 to go." Her fury shifted to fear. "I warned you," I added, locking eyes with her. Then I turned and walked out, leaving stunned silence in my wake. Over the next month, the police questioned me twice more. Linda insisted I was somehow involved in Mark's demise, but they had nothing to charge me with. The case eventually went cold. People moved on. One evening, I was watching TV when headlights cut across my living room window. A patrol car. Sighing, I stood and answered the door. "You're late," I said dryly as 2 officers stepped out. "Mr. Lawson," one of them began formally, sliding a photo across the table. I glanced down at it. "Do you know a Luke Carter?" "Sure," I replied evenly, studying the image. The officer's eyes narrowed. "How do you know him?" I met his stare without hesitation. "I hired him to keep an eye on my ex-wife." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Why?" I smirked. "Because she seems to attract trouble. And since my kids live with her, I figured it was best to make sure they stay safe. Carter mostly watched at night, making sure everything was in order." "Your ex-wife reported feeling followed," the officer said sharply. "She saw Mr. Carter multiple times and called us." When we questioned him, he said you hired him. I remained calm. Is that illegal? It's not against the law, the officer admitted, but it's dangerously close to harassment. If it continues, you could face charges. I nodded. Noted. If the department wants to take over protecting my kids, I'll gladly step back. Otherwise, I'll keep making sure they're safe. The officer crossed his arms. Why don't you try working this out with your ex-wife? I gave him a flat look. Last time I tried that, I ended up in jail. That shut him up. They let me go with a tired, predictable warning. I barely paid attention. I hadn't hired Carter to be subtle. I wanted Linda to feel his presence, to know she was being watched. But if that wasn't enough, I had a backup plan. The next guy I hired was even less discreet. Leather jacket, scruffy beard, the kind of guy who made people cross the street. He only worked a few hours every fourth night, but he delivered exactly what I wanted. Unease. The goal was simple, push Linda to the edge. If she cracked, I'd use it to secure full custody of my kids. What do you want from me, Jake? She screamed into the phone one night, her voice shaking. Honestly, I replied, deadpan. For you to drop dead. She hung up without another word. Later that night, as I sat on my porch with a drink, the inevitable happened. A police cruiser pulled into my driveway. I smirked as two officers stepped out. Figured you'd show up sooner or later. Linda had accused me of threatening her, but this time, I was ready. By the time we reached the station, my attorney was already waiting. My client never threatened Mrs. Davis, he said smoothly. He simply expressed a personal opinion about her demise. That's not a threat, it's free speech. The officers weren't convinced. She feels threatened, one of them countered. Especially since your client has hired individuals to follow her. It's creating a hostile situation. My lawyer barely blinked. Hiring someone to observe another person isn't illegal. Unless you have hard evidence of wrongdoing, this is a waste of time. The taller officer sighed. Mr. Lawson, why don't you just move on? People get divorced every day. What happened is unfortunate, but you need to let it go. I smirked. If she snaps and something happens, you'll know where to look, right? The officers exchanged a glance. If she agrees to give up custody of the kids, my client will step back entirely, my lawyer added. That's a matter for the courts, the officer said stiffly. The meeting ended, and I walked out, completely unbothered. Sunday morning, I was enjoying my coffee when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors. Opening the door, I found Linda's parents standing there. Jake, can we have a word? Her father asked. I stepped aside. Come in. They were dressed in their Sunday best, probably coming from church. I offered coffee, but they declined. We came to talk about Linda, her father began hesitantly. We know she's made mistakes, and what happened to you wasn't fair. But she's still our daughter, and we're worried about her. I leaned against the counter. I don't want anything to happen to her either. But she made her choices. Now she has to live with them. My priority is the kids, I continued. They'd be better off with me. I don't want them caught in the crossfire if things take a turn. Her parents exchanged uneasy glances. We'll talk to her, her mother said slowly. But you know how stubborn she is. I exhaled, shaking my head. The Linda I married wouldn't have cheated or stabbed me in the back. I don't recognize who she is now. But if you're expecting forgiveness, don't hold your breath. I let my voice drop. I don't forgive. And I don't forget. They left quickly after that, clearly unsettled by my words. Good. They needed to understand exactly where I stood. Thursday evening, the confrontation I had been waiting for finally arrived. Just after sunset, the doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole. Linda. She hadn't called ahead, which made her sudden appearance all the more satisfying. I opened the door with a smirk. Evening, Linda. Care for a drink? How about hemlock? She shot back. I laughed. Do you ever stop being a pain in the ass? She pushed past me into the house. I shut the door behind her, still amused. What brings you by? Finally decide to admit you've been wrong all along. She ignored the jab and sat stiffly in the living room. I want to talk about the house, she said flatly. Our house. I asked, feigning surprise. You mean the one I've been paying for single-handedly since the divorce? I still own half of it, she snapped. I want it sold. What's it going to take for you to lower the price? I grinned. An act of God. Her fists clenched. Fine. Just get it done. She leaned forward slightly. I want you out of this neighborhood and out of my life. That's never going to happen, I said calmly. Her tone softened. You still hate me that much? I held her gaze. More than you could imagine. She swallowed. It wasn't planned, she murmured. What happened with Mark wasn't intentional. I scoffed. Oh? You accidentally fell into his bed? For months. Linda's breath came out sharp, controlled. I loved you, Jake. I let out a humorless laugh. And yet, you chose to destroy everything we built. Her voice wavered. I never wanted it to end like this. I smiled coldly. Yeah? I bet Mark thought the same thing when that car hit him. Her face paled. You're sick, she whispered. I tilted my head. And you're a liar. Linda stood abruptly. Sell the house. I swirled my drink and took a slow sip. We'll see. She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I sat there, exhaling, listening to the silence she left behind. Linda thought she could rewrite history, smooth things over with cheap apologies. But some wounds don't heal. And no matter what she did, no matter how much she begged, I wasn't done making her pay. It just happened, Linda muttered, eyes darting away. I scoffed. Save the excuses. They're as empty as the vows you broke. She stood abruptly. You're impossible. And you're predictable, I shot back, opening the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out. She hesitated, as if expecting me to soften. Instead, I crossed my arms. Don't insult me, Linda. Nothing just happens. Unless he had a gun to your head, you went along with it. Was he so much better in bed that you decided to burn down our marriage? Her expression tightened, but she didn't flinch. It wasn't about that, Jake. He needed me. He had no one else. And somewhere along the way, we started depending on each other. I let out a sharp laugh. What were you doing? Running a charity for emotionally bankrupt men. I needed you. Our kids needed you. But I guess none of that mattered because some sad stray wagged his tail at you. My voice lowered, venom dripping from every word. Now he's rotting in the ground, and ironically, he's the least needy person I can think of. A flicker of horror crossed her face. I only regret that I wasn't the one driving the car that ended his pathetic existence, I added with a cold smile. Linda took a shaky breath. Do you even hear yourself? You're so full of hate it's disturbing. Do you enjoy the fact that he's dead? I leaned in slightly. I didn't get here on my own. You and your late boyfriend deserve the credit for making me this way. Bullshit, she snapped. That's just an excuse. Do you think every divorced person turns into this? You're not the only one who's ever been cheated on. I waved a hand dismissively. I don't give a damn about other people's marriages. This is about mine. She exhaled sharply. Where do we go from here, Jake? The house is the last thing tying us together. I folded my arms. What about the kids? I'm not giving them up, she said firmly. And there's nothing you can say to change my mind. Her defiance only made my mind work faster. I steadied myself, letting my voice drop to something eerily calm. I'm not here to convince you, Linda. You got custody because you pushed me into a situation that cost me everything. If I hadn't lost my temper and gone after Mark and his car, things would have been different. I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice even more. But Mark got exactly what was coming to him. And now, it's just you and me. Her face drained of color. Jake, are you threatening me? I smirked. Threaten you? Never. I'd never deprive my kids of their mother. But life is unpredictable, Linda. Heart attacks. Accidents. Even a bolt of lightning. I let the silence stretch before adding, I just hope, for their sake, you've got your affairs in order. Her breath hitched. The line was stolen from a movie, but the chill in the air was all real. She stood abruptly. I'm done here. For what it's worth, we had 12 good years. I'm sorry it ended like this. She leaned forward slightly, as if to kiss my cheek. I shoved her back, harder than I intended. She stumbled. Don't ever try to touch me again, I growled. Her eyes widened in shock. I just thought. You thought what? I cut her off. That we'd be friends? That I'd forgive you? I took a step closer, letting my disgust show. You make me sick. She mumbled. I'm sorry. Don't be. My voice was ice. Because I'm not. She turned, heading down the driveway. Just as she reached the sidewalk, I called after her. Oh, and Linda? She paused, glancing back. You know that look you just gave me? Mark had the exact same look on his face just before that car hit him. I smirked. Too bad I didn't have a camera. Her face went white. Then she bolted. I closed the door, feeling satisfied. The truth? I had set the fire at Mark's house. 2 Gatorade bottles of gasoline, a cigarette, and a quiet exit. I made sure the place was empty before I lit it up, but it didn't spread as fast as I'd hoped. Still, I was in and out in under 5 minutes. As for Mark's end of life, that wasn't my doing. Dumb luck took care of him. Wrong place, wrong time. If he looked both ways, like his mother probably taught him, he'd still be here. Linda and her family still thought I had something to do with it. Part of me wished I had, but I wasn't about to risk going back to prison. Instead, I let Linda's paranoia do the work for me. Every doubt I planted, every hint I dropped, pushed her closer to a breakdown. And when she finally cracked, I'd be ready to take full custody of my kids. Meanwhile, I wasn't leaving. I liked my house. I liked my life. Most of all, I liked being just up the street from my kids. Who knows? Maybe one day they'd choose to live with me full-time. The silver lining in all this mess? I met someone new. Jessica. She worked for the Department of Corrections. We met during my probation check-ins. Tough, no nonsense, unshakable. The kind of woman who didn't take crap from anyone. We hit it off, but she was clear. No dating until my probation ended. When it finally did, we went out, and I laid it all out. My baggage, my past, my revenge. She didn't even flinch. If I had $1 for every sob story I've heard from convicts, she said dryly, I could retire tomorrow. We were figuring things out. You need to let go, Jake, she told me one night. If you don't, you'll never move forward. She took a sip of her drink, then smirked. And if you mess up and land back in jail, I'll personally make your life hell. I chuckled, but I didn't doubt her for a second. With Jessica, I was learning to trust again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was ready to move on. Maybe even love again.